All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to Plano Public Library's U.S. Federal Census, how it can help locate your ancestor or ancestors plural. So as part of the Genealogy Center, I am one of the librarians that works there. My name is Meredith. I have supporting in chat Sarah, another genealogy center librarian. So she can help answer any of your questions. If at any point you do have questions, please put those in the chat and Sarah will either answer them directly or pass them on to me, and I will answer them out loud in our session here. We are also recording this for later, so if you want to watch it again, you have any questions that you want to review the content, it will be available on our YouTube channel, so you can find it there for later watching. Or if you have to leave early for any reason, you can finish up later. So let's get started. So we're going to do a quick rundown of the history of the census because we have not always done it the same. It has evolved greatly over the years. Um, so the founding fathers included the use of a census in the Constitution. It is Article 1, Section 2. The census in the Constitution is to appoint representatives and to direct taxes. So the quote kind of roughly is, representatives shall be appointed according to their respective numbers. The actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of the Congress of the United States and within every subsequent term of 10 years, in such manner as they shall be law direct. So this means that our first federal census occurred 1790. An official date was set to do the census and a time to get it done by. The enumerator had to record information as if time had stopped. So basically, that person was in that place at that time, and we considered it across the country, even though it did take an extensive amount of time to tally all the people. The federal census is an important part of American history, and it is also, thankfully, a great resource for genealogical research. All right, so a little more of the history. From 1790 to 1840, the census information was completely public. Up to this point, enumerators were creating their own forms. They were gathering the information, and the information was available to all. After 1850, there was a realization that, hey, this is a lot of people's personal information, their homes, where they live, their family members' names, all of that. And it was decided that the information should be handled with a little more discretion. 1830 was the first use of uniform printed schedules. Enumerators had to, like I said, make their forms by hand with whatever was available. Sometimes they could print out a batch that they would use, but other times the lines were drawn by hand, and there was a lot of deviation on how it was set up, which slowed down the process greatly. To speed up the process, as I said, 1830 brought out those uniform printed schedules. And in 1850, the government started to use more information for more purposes and started to ask more questions so that they could gather information about the economy, industry, and social conditions of the country. When they sanctioned the 1850 census, they included that they wanted it to exhibit a full view of the pursuits, industry, education, and resources of the country. So the census went from being a very basic tally of people to having a lot more detailed information. And this is part of the reason that there was a decision for that discretion regarding the census information because it was more and more detailed and more private. All right. And in from 1790 to 1870, the census was conducted by federal marshals and their assistants. So um, these were the people that would go out and conduct their work. A lot of times it was the assistants who did the actual surveying and reporting back to the federal marshals, but it just depended on the area and what resources were available to them. Starting in 1880, there were specifically hired and trained census takers that replaced the US Marshals, which makes sense because there is a limited number of US Marshals. They had to really expand who could get out there and take the census. They also stepped up the expectation of protecting people's information. The census takers took an oath not to disclose the information that they gathered. In 1890, the census had over 13,000 questions covering 22 subjects. It was very ambitious. Unfortunately, most households only answered about 45 of those questions. It's a real example of being more choosy about what questions you ask to get the information that you want. And this year was also the year that unfortunately got most damaged and lost due to a fire that occurred in 1921. Unfortunately, only about 1% of this particular census is still around, and we'll get a little more detail on that as we go. And then finally, the big one, 1978 is when the 72-year rule became official law. If you aren't aware, all of our censuses are basically unavailable until 72 years after the census was recorded. So this started out as an agreement between the director of the Bureau of Census and the Archivist of the United States that was reached from letters between them in determining how best to protect the information. That agreement happened in 1952. And then, unfortunately, as the years went on, they started to get conflicting ideas of how to deal with the information and who should have access to it. And so Congress resolved this conflict by actually making the rule of the 72 years as a piece of legislation in 1978. All right, any questions on that so far? I mean, it's a basic history rundown, so nothing too crazy. All right. So, data that you can get from the census. So, different censuses, is that the plural for it? Had different amounts of data available. But the basic stuff that you can look for your genealogy purposes include what's seen here: name, age, sometimes date of birth, possibly more likely year of birth or estimated year of birth, place of birth, dates of marriage or year of marriage, number of children. In later ones, we get into relationships to the head of the household, race, and then there's other information in some of the other schedules, including slaves, Indians, different influx of immigration, that sort of thing. So as I said, different years had different information. So I have a little breakdown of all of that. So from 1790 to 1840, census was strictly limited to free males and their households who paid taxes and had the right to vote. These were the only people that were counted. Um, Typically, it was the name of the head of the household and then just a tallying of the number of people in that household. Um, so, number of enslaved people in each household was also counted. The age groups got more distinct in separation with each new census for all of those categories. So the earliest census was very cut and dry. I think it was like younger than 16 years, older than 16 years. And they got more distinct as the years went on to get more detailed information. There was also a counting of how many worked in selected industries that they started adding to the census. And then 1850 was when they really kicked up the personal data collecting. So this is where they got into listing each household member with their individual data. We also have from 1850 to 1880, they recorded marriage within the year. So if somebody got married within the year before that census, a little check mark would note that. And so that would kind of give you a window of when they got married. And then from 1850 to 1930, place of birth was reported. Now, this was typically limited to what state that they were born in. Um, I have seen a few that just simply put United States, and that was it. They clearly did not want to disclose more information. And that was, I guess, an acceptable response. From 1880 to 1930, place of birth for parents for each person was also listed, including whether or not they were foreign born and what country that would have been that the parent came from. 1880 marked the beginning of identifying relationships to the head of the household. Um, Earlier, from 1850 to 1880, you could typically infer what the relationship was based on um, the age of the person and whether or not they had the same last name indicated, that sort of thing. But this stepped it up and clearly indicated mother-in-law, hired servant, those sorts of things, as well as children and wife. And then from 1900s to 1830s, there was a massive influx of immigration to the United States. Um, so there were added columns for a person's year of immigration to the United States. It also included columns indicating the person's naturalization status. They had answers of AL for alien, PA for first papers, so basically starting the process, and then NA for naturalized. So well, I've got a couple of examples here. Do we have any questions before I get into these examples?
We did have a patron asking about a specific name in the census.
Mm,
I will say in general, we're not going to have information on specific names. This
yeah,
class is going to really be more just like general how to search the censuses. And that'll be through like Ancestry or Family Search. So hang on, keep watching. We hopefully will give you some more information on how you could search and find that sort of stuff.
yes, yeah. All right, so looking at our census examples here, just kind of to give you an idea of what sort of information was captured. The first image we have on the left is the 1790s census here from Gloucestershire. I totally butchered that, I'm sure, but New York, I believe, is where it was located. And as you can see, it's very limited in its scope of tallies. And then I have 1840 census up here, and we've gotten it very broken down. You've got from infant through age 20. They have it broken up in to groups of 5 every 5 years, and then 10 years from there all the way to age 100, which very few. And the 1840 census was a two-pager. The first page is the top bit here that does the free white persons, including heads of family, which are the ones that had their names written, of course. You have free colored persons, slaves, male and female of both broken up. And of course, as can be expected, this is a smaller division here of the age range. And then some information about the industries that they were involved in, um, whether or not they were involved in military service, um, whether or not they could had any mental or physical deficits, and schooling. And so this was a two-page across census for tallying because they had to have all of those little columns. So example of getting a little more information, and these are the ones where it's truly very helpful for genealogy work. We get into having families where each family unit has the head of household at the top. And then when there's a little line by it, that means they share the same name, listing them out, what their profession is, birthplace. For a little while there, they asked about value of real estate. So you can see a little bit of history on that as well for your ancestors. Um, this one here has the location of birth for the individual, and then it doesn't mention where the parents were from, but it does note whether or not the parents are of foreign birth. So, and a little bit of educational information, whether or not they can read or write is considered important. And then get to our 1930 census, a lot more information and a lot more detail. We've got your relationships to the head of house listed out here. We've got all sorts of personal description information involved in there, places of birth for both the person and their parents, if they had any foreign language, occupations, employment, whether or not they're veterans. So a lot more detail in that. Any questions about that so far? All right, let's get into how to find your ancestors. So, as we say, and I think pretty much every single one of our classes, get organized first as the starting point for all research. You want to choose a specific ancestor to start with. If you start too broad, it's going to be an overwhelming amount of information, and keeping track of things is going to get a little crazy. So it's always better to pick one person to start with and gather the facts you already have. So my personal recommendation is start with somebody you have a lot of information on, because this is going to give you the most results when it comes to your searches. And from that, you will be able to springboard from those lists of family members on back through the years. You'll also want to decide on a census year to start your search. It's better to start in a specific year rather than doing a broad search, just because that gives you a little more focus and prevents you from being overwhelmed by a large number of returns in a search. A lot of resources do allow you to search very broadly, but it can be hard to find the specific person you're looking for if you don't start more constricted in your search. If you can, begin with the most recent census record that person was alive and work your way backward. Um, and search on a census year at a time, going back. Um, and currently available is 1790 through 1950. Um, as I said, unfortunately, 1890 is mostly gone, but all those other years, for the most part, present. All right, some more search tips that we have. You're going to want to be open to searching and finding different names, spellings, and birth dates. The census is very much kind of like a weird game of telephone. You are having one family member who typically reports for all of the family members. So hopefully that family member knows how to spell the family members' names. They talk to the census enumerator, who hopefully knows how to translate that name into something spelled out coherently. And then a lot of these databases, you're working with indexes, and hopefully that information is indexed correctly. So that's a lot of ways for a name to get altered. So you'll want to keep that in mind as you search. You'll want to try a wildcard search. A lot of the searches on the databases use question mark for a letter, or the little star symbol for several letters if you don't know whether or not you've got a specific spelling correctly. So here's an example. So like Anderson could be Anderson with the O or Anderson with the E. And William, of course, has all sorts of various ways it can be spelled, especially if William liked to go by a nickname. So those are a couple of different ways that you can kind of expand your search results for oddities. Um, Another option is to try searching by surname or first name only. Uh, oh, and sorry, I forgot to mention the birth dates. Something to keep in mind with birth dates, a lot of these census records only recorded the age of the person from their last birth date, or where their age was at the point of census taking. So there's a lot of plussing and minusing when it comes to looking for birth years, as well as the fact that a lot of people may not have necessarily reported their age correctly. So try searching for surnames and first names only. If you know a middle name, you can try that to help narrow it down, especially if you have a very common name that you're working with. And you'll also want to try both maiden and married names for women, especially if you aren't sure what date they got married. And so when they would have become part of their husband's household from a census point of view, um, you'll want to do searches for both of these so that you can get as accurate a result as possible. Typically, maiden name does not show up once the woman is married. They'll show up on the census under their husband's name. But if you do not know when they got married, that's definitely a good way to make sure that you catch them. Oop, skip that too fast. As I mentioned with the birth dates, try adding about 1 to 3 years for birth dates. Sometimes you can have a bigger gap, especially if the person was not accurate about their age, either weren't aware of what age they were or are lying for other reasons. So it can get a little messy with that birth year. Okay. Any questions as we're cruising through our search tips?
Somebody had asked if Family Search is the only site to search the census or if there's like a public website to search for free.
Mm,
You can find all census records on the National Archives or the U.S. Census Bureau websites. Um, like Meredith was talking about being indexed, they aren't necessarily indexed like they are on Ancestry or Family Search. Those companies use volunteers often to do a lot
clean
of
everything up.
yeah, to read some of the data and help with that sort of stuff. So even if you're searching on different sites, you might get different answers as well.
Yeah, Family Search, fortunately, is a free account. So I believe the census records are at the level of the free account where you can see those directly. Um, and then, of course, we'll get into a few of the databases we have available near the end. So I'll hold off on that before I get bogged down in that.
Yes, and then somebody was asking if we have a handout. Um, Not to my knowledge. Like we said at the beginning, this class will be recorded and you can go and watch it later on the Plano Library YouTube page. I did put
Mhm.
the link for that in the chat. Or if you would like to come in and have more questions about this class specifically or wanted maybe a printout of the PowerPoint, if you just come into the Genealogy Center or email genealogy@plano.gov, we might be able to provide that for you. Just let us
Yes,
know.
or at the very least, we can also do the a PDF of the slides.
Yeah, so yeah, just come in or email us at genealogy@plano.gov and we can see how we can help you there.
Yes. All right, so on to more with our tips. So some options to further your searching for an individual is try searching related information. So if you know other relatives to the individual you're looking for, or possibly address of where they may have lived previously, this can help narrow your search, especially the address. Even if you don't know an exact address, but you know they lived in a city, since the census was conducted by county regions and they have enumeration districts that are broken up, that can help you kind of shrink your scope of your search so that you can find the specific individual that you are looking for. Um, Another option is immigration information. And if you happen to have when they were naturalized, that sort of thing, that can provide some additional information. Um, You can also look at everyone that is on a page of the census record. Families often lived near each other for sometimes generations. So you can often see maybe a few pages backwards or a few pages forward. Um, like, for example, a daughter gets married, moves into a household just a couple of doors down. Now you've got another branch of your family that is literally within the same town. So um, you can do a little searching to see if you can see those connections. And then, of course, you want to make sure to track your research. A lot of the databases have tools to do this, but if you are at any point working with physical indexes or physical records or anything like that, making copies of the pages you find is very helpful. You can do digital version of making copies of pages. By either printing them out, saving them as PDFs, or saving them as image files from a lot of these databases. And of course, cite your sources so that you can go back to them as needed and are aware of which sources you've already searched so you're not doubling up on your work. Any questions on the? Okay, we'll move on. There are a few special populations to consider. These were enumerated in separate ways, different from the standard white population. So we have a few different ones listed here. Native Americans were not identified in any way on the census from 1790 to 1840. By 1860, Native Americans living in general population were counted for the first time. So those living on reservations were not counted because they were not taxed. They were considered a separate nation. In 1900, enumeration on reservations as well as general population began. So if you are looking for any family members that have Native American background, you might want to keep that in mind when you are doing your searches. We get into enslaved Blacks and people of color. Before 1870, the census only listed whether or not they were free or enslaved, and typically only had tally marks. 1870 was the first time that anybody who was enslaved was listed by name. 1850 and 1860 had separate slave schedules that were done as part of the census. Only New Jersey and District of Columbia submitted returns, and the names of enslavers are frequently listed with a personal description of each of the enslaved. When it comes to clergy, there's a separate one for Catholic sisters, known as nuns, and brothers, monks, who discontinued the use of their birth name. Sisters or brothers may be listed by their surname, so you might be able to find that family connection. Military was another one because there were bases stationed all over the place. You could be listed at the base where they were stationed and at their home. If it's Navy, of course, that'll be the ship that they're stationed on rather than a base. Veteran status was reported in the 1840, 1890, 1910, and 1930 censuses. And then 1900 had active duty military were the first counted as population abroad. State military censuses were also conducted as well. So depending on the state that you're looking at, you'll have different resources available for that. So some things to be aware of when you are dealing with the census. As I mentioned, there are, of course, the issues with the fact that this information is being handed down through several layers of people, but you also have legibility of the enumerator's handwriting. It got a little easier with the printed records, but you're still typically relying on a person to write out a name. And so I have an example over here of a portion from, I believe it was, I'm trying to remember, I should have captioned it, but I did not do the year for it. I think this was from 1850 or something like that. Because you do have the family members, but as you can see, this person's handwriting is very bunched. The R's and S's look very similar. You're looking at the names as they were indexed on the side here, matching with the names written out in the actual census. I'm honestly impressed that the indexers were able to get some of these because it's really hard to tell. But also keep in mind that indexers are not infallible. You will see sometimes completely wrong takes on how a name is spelled just because that person either heard the name wrong or had a different understanding of how a name is spelled. That ties into spelling and nicknames. A lot of times parents would share their kids' nicknames rather than their full names or use middle names. There's a lot of differences there. And of course, spelling, even with some of the most common names we have, has a variety of spellings. Sometimes you'll see ones where they've transposed the names, so switched the middle and the first name. So also errors in the original records. So you can see like where the person originally spelled it one way, went back and tried to fix it, and now you're trying to read an A that's kind of a scribble. Um, you also have the barriers of foreign language and people who could not speak English trying to share their information with the enumerator, or straight up secretive and dishonest informants. Sometimes people did not want to be found, and so they would provide different names, or their family wanted to maybe sound less foreign, so they'd altered their name to sound less like they came from Italy or less like they came from Spain, and they've altered it to sound more quote unquote American. Here's a few more examples of stuff you might have to deal with. This is one single family from 1900 through 1920. You can see the head of the family is John Todd, and the census person wrote down ROBT for Robert Lee. So you'd have to know to look for that. And between 1910 and 1900, either the parents or the census taker opted to go from writing down first names to writing down middle names. So John A became Arthur, which was spelled like the person who writes a book, Author, which was probably not how they intended to spell it. As you see down in 1920, they used a R, still kept the O. But you see that the middle names carried down to 1920 as well. So you'd have to have a familiarity with the family members and the names, middle names that corresponded to the first names to be able to keep track of this progression. Another example, right here we have Toddy, which is actually a family just down the street from the Todd family, which may be why the first census taker here wrote it as they did. Maybe they had just taken the Todd's census and heard Toddy. In later censuses, the name was spelled Tody. And then it looks like down here, it's still a Toidy, but an R has been added. But then the index here does Tandy, which doesn't look even close. But you can tell based on relatives' names that carry over that they are, in fact, the same family. But these are the types of obstacles that you might have to overcome as you work through your family members. All right, any questions on all of those tips that we've provided? No? Okay. All right, we'll move on to what if I can't find what I'm looking for? The roadblocks that we all hit. So our first bit of looking at incomplete information, as I mentioned, the 1890 census was lost in a fire in 1921. This was due largely in part to how the census records were being stored before the National Archives were established. They were basically kept in a basement. Most of the records were in what was considered a quote unquote fireproof room, but unfortunately, the 1890 census, which was kind of one of the more recent ones, was on the outside of the room. So they got fairly toasted, as well as water damage from the process of putting out the fire. The water damage is also notable in some of the earlier census records as well, but the one that received the biggest hit was the 1890s. Only 1% of records survived. You can find those surviving records that have been scanned on Family Search definitely has them. I'm not sure for Ancestry, but you can see just how absolutely limited it is. There's sections where only 1 or 2 pages for a whole enumeration district were saved, and even those are very hard to read. Another reason a lot of it was not salvageable was after the fire, there was a lot of going back and forth of having to have the insured file claims and how do they deal with this stuff and how do they preserve it. So a lot of the records just sat literally growing mold. So unfortunately, a lot of records were lost not only from the initial damage, but from the damage that accumulated as they deteriorated. And just to give you an idea of what was left, 1% is about 6,000 individuals, where the population of 1890 was 63 million. So it is a big loss, a big hit. Also, physical copies of the 1900 to 1940 censuses were destroyed in 1956 to save space. However, some of these had been very poorly filmed. Technology has come quite a long way, as well as a understanding of the importance of making clear copies. So a lot of it is completely illegible. Like you'd be there's just no way to read it at this point, especially for 1910. Um, so yeah, it's unfortunate. So outside of the scope of your federal every 10 year census, there are a few other places that you can look. Uh, so some examples of those would be state censuses. For quite a while, states did their own individual censuses, as well as territories to keep track of those. Um, you also have city and county directories. That's a great way to see listed families, voter lists, as well as alumni directories. These are most often, of course, needed for 1890 and 1790 census, because those state censuses were what was mainly being used before the 1790 census. So some more census records, as we mentioned, the pre-1790 censuses. So these would be state and territory. The major ones are Louisiana, Mississippi, Michigan, Maryland, Delaware, Illinois, and New Mexico. And then there's also something to consider with the gold miners. The gold rush that occurred meant that there were a lot of people who were not in their normal abodes as it is listed in the census. And so tracking them down can be a little challenging. Some ways that you can check that is through the state census for those years to see if maybe they got listed um, as part of a miners camp. If the family member happened to be the person to own the mining company that was working in a given state, there is also the industrial schedules from 1850 to 1870, where the Bureau of Census recorded information about manufacturing, mining, fisheries, and other businesses that had a gross production of over $500. So if they were able to get enough gold to be productive over $500, they would have been listed. And this schedule includes the name of the business as well as the owner, an amount of capital invested, quantity and value of material used, labor, machinery, and products. They typically also would have listed the number of laborers and hours of those laborers. Unfortunately, employees were not listed in this. Uh, A big one to look at for the California gold rush would be the California State Census of 1852. There are also a few other schedules, the non-population schedules that can be used to look for people. They are often similar to the general population census, but have more specific information about those topics. So, for example, the agricultural schedule will detail information regarding farms. So, who owned them, how big they were, what kinds of livestock they might have had if they were a livestock farm, possibly what crops they grew. Um, so, if you had farmers in your family, that might be a good source of figuring out where family members were located. They also had the defective, dependent, and delinquent classes. So these were people who were deemed mentally incompetent, sometimes in asylums. The 1880s one had more detail than just a tally mark for that. You could also find, as I mentioned, for the mining industry and manufacturing, um, the mining was keenly mentioned in 1850 through the 1870, but other industries and manufacturing were listed in 1810, 1820, and 1850 to 1885. Mortality was also noted, though that was more of a focus on how many, of course, died. You had social statistics and then veterans. Unfortunately, the veterans in the 1891 not going to have much of that resource available. So census finding aids and indexes. There are a lot of different ways to kind of work through the census. There's maps available that can help you figure out what a city translates to as far as an enumeration district, which is the grouping for the census. So families were listed as part of a specific district that was counted. So these descriptions and maps could be used to figure out if you knew a family lived in, say, Waco, you could figure out which district they were part of to help locate them within the census. There are catalogs that exist as well as indexes. Most of the census has been fairly well indexed, but as Sarah mentioned, a lot of it has been done by volunteers. In recent years, AI has been used a lot to do at least initial indexing, and then volunteers come in and help clean it up, which has greatly increased the speed with which it's been done. That's why the 1950s census got done fairly quickly in comparison to years in the past. Um,
I'll add to that. It might have got done speedier. That is not to say it was done as accurately as
fair,
people doing it by hand in the past.
fair.
They have also used things like OCR, optical character recognition, when scanning to try and do some of this. So this isn't the first time that they've used computers to try and help index the census, but you know, as it keeps getting better, but it's not perfect yet.
Yes, yeah. There is something to be said for the volunteers who were going through and manually looking at each one because you had to take a nice slow pace, whereas volunteers that are doing proofreading can sometimes miss things or just go, yeah, that looks right. Um, so that's something to consider. There are transcripts with indexes done by individuals and genealogical societies available through several different options that we'll share in just a minute. And then, as you can see here listed, Soundex and Miracode. I'll go into a little bit of detail of what that is, just because it's pretty neat. So Soundex is a phonetic index that groups together names that sound alike but are spelled differently. So for example, Stuart, spelled W-A-R-T, versus Stuart, spelled S-T-U-A-R-T. So this can help searchers find names that are spelled differently than originally expected, or were misspelled by the census taker, or what have you. Um, so there are some states of the 1910 census that are indexed by Soundex, while others were indexed using Miracode, which is slightly different, but same idea behind Soundex. The code numbers that are formed in the same way, but they have different types of cards. They use cards for these things. Um, there are only 21 states where Soundex or Miracode was used in 1910. So those are Alabama, Kentucky, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, California, Michigan, South Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, Tennessee, Georgia, Missouri, Texas, Illinois, North Carolina, Virginia, Kansas, Ohio, and West Virginia. Uh, so Soundex was available for all families in all states in the 1900s and 1920s, where as parts of 1880, 1910, and 1930 also had Soundex used. So what you see on the picture here, Ancestry.com uses a Soundex search to help find names. So if you have a name that is one of those ones that has multiple different spellings, you can select the Soundex option like you see here, and it'll return ones that are more related, not just from a spelling standpoint, but from how they sound when they're pronounced. So that's very handy for those close knit families. For example, my maiden name is Hudman, often mistaken for Hudson. So being able to have that return similar names would be helpful. I think I also had a Kramer and Creamer spelling error in my family history. So, all those sorts of things. So why use census records? I mean, basically, this whole process of genealogy is knitting together clues to gather your information for each of your family members. So census records can help lead you towards other records. They can help confirm information that you may have gotten from unreliable sources, and help give you new direction for your research. So some examples of this information can be number of children, birthplaces, divorcees and widows, that you can then use the documents of those divorces, or obituaries and that sorts of thing. Immigration clues. Didn't know Uncle Bob was in the military. Well, now you do, because you can see it in the census, and then you can go look for his military records and see where he lived, put all of that together. Occupation clues as well can help direct where you look for land property ownership, that sort of thing. So all of that goes together to help you find your family members. And the immigration clues can be very handy for where you need to go next outside of the United States, which is, of course, its own bag of worms to open and get into, because every country is different, but knowing where to get started is always the first step. Now, speaking of first steps, where do you find census records? We've already mentioned a couple of those. So free access, as I said, Family Search has free access to the census records with your free account. You can take those records and save them, and then use them to build your family tree. There's also US GenWeb, which is a whole network of genealogical societies, people interested in genealogy, that have gathered information together to be used for research purposes for genealogy. Great resource. A little old school, but still great. And then, of course, the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, has microfilm. You can also check local libraries for access to that. With your Plano library card, you get free access through, of course, Ancestry Library Edition, which you have to access from within the library. So visit any one of our 5 locations. And I do believe, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Sarah, but I think that you don't just have to use our public computers, you can use it through the Wi-Fi, I believe. And so you can bring in your own personal laptop and just use the Wi-Fi to get access to that.
For Ancestry?
Yes.
Yes, I believe that is true.
Yeah.
As long as you are connected to the library's network.
Yes. It's all about
Let's see.
IP addresses.
See, and somebody had asked in the Q&A, is this link on the library's genealogy website? If you could message again and clarify what link, um, I can answer that, but most of these, yes, will be on the library's website. I will put a link in the chat to the Genealogy Center page and where most of our databases will be, and then to the General Library Research and Learn page where all of our databases will be linked as well.
Yes. Yeah, the resources that are listed here, the only one that's a little weird is Heritage Quest is accessible through TechShare, which is a shared database resource that our library is a part of. And because of that, that particular database you have to access through the TechShare link under our research heading on our database page. It's not specifically listed on our Genealogy Center page. So that's the one weird one, but great resource to have. So you can use that through the TechShare databases. And then there are paid ones if you want to go that route. Ancestry.com, which is very similar to Ancestry Library Edition, but has some different features. If you are interested in finding out the difference, we do have a whole class on that is on our YouTube page that can give you details on that. There's also Find My Path and Fold 3. We have a library access version, and I'm not sure what the difference is of the subscription version, but very similar to Ancestry.com. I'm sure there's additional features that you don't normally have access to through the free version. All right, we have gotten to the end. Any questions before we go? And if you think of any or you just don't feel comfortable asking right now, you are, of course, always welcome to send those questions to genealogy@plano.gov. And our genealogy librarian team will get back to you as quickly as possible. And we can either work out answering the question directly, or if it's something a little more advanced, we can direct you to our book, A Genealogy Librarian resource, our service, which is available through our website. There's a little form you filled out. We'll help you out, do some one-on-one work with you for 30 minutes at a time, and really try to bust up any roadblocks you might have.
Yeah, no other questions. Just wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you for those kind words, audience. We appreciate that.
Yes. Thank you. We'll see y'all in the Genealogy Center, hopefully. Have a great day.